of that. He is pushing himself forward, and as someone who understands and identifies the conversations that we should be having here. Directions is a series of lectures, sometimes given by an artist. I guess that would be a way of reducing what you are, and I guess that's probably the title and the label that society likes to give us. But also is going to be given by us. Next week, in this very same room, at this very same time, we are going to all come together as student forum to discuss the future of this school. As a participatory democracy, the AA has a very specific way of understanding how we move forward, and I do hope that we are all going to participate in a configuration that will make of this table a much larger forum. I'm not going to take any time. We are all here to hear them talk, to actually hear them speak. I want to thank you all for setting the direction of this place with me at the helm of it, or at the back of it. And without any further delay, I just want to thank Marko for bringing Wolfgang into this room and to actually let us understand how someone like Wolfgang, who is an artist, who has understood the power of immediacy, of the temporality act, of putting an image next to a geopolitical map, next to a political condition, can really start to agitate, to transform, and to move things definitely forward. So, thank you, everyone. The word is with you, Marko.
Thank you. Should we have that image in the background, just as we speak, and then we'll... Yes. Oops. Okay, that will stay there for a while. Hello, everyone. Do you remember the evening of the 22nd of June, 2016? Now, according to personal account, Wolfgang Tillmans was crossing the Millennium Bridge. Behind him, Tate Modern. On his right, yellow-red sky after sunset, tears in his eyes. He thought to himself that this could be the final evening before a new era. 2 days later, he recalled this moment and promises of openness of year 2000, the year Millennium Bridge was built, the year Tate Modern was established in the former Bankside Power Station, the year he became the first non-British artist to be awarded Turner Prize. With the Brexit vote, Wolfgang has yet again witnessed fragility in life, but consciously or not, in this account, he seems to offer a glimpse of hope in one thing that remains more robust than other fragilities in our society, and that is the building behind him, the bridge below his feet. Now, I would also argue that a glimpse of hope is Wolfgang's work itself, and its sort of hyper-realistic humanity, even at the most abstract. And Wolfgang, if we start with humanity, I mean, I feel like we should start with humanity, and I thought how, and then I thought there is this one kind of most humane question of all, which is also kind of the most inhumane question of all, because it kind of, when we ask the question, we almost don't really have the time or empathy to hear the answer. So I'd just quite like to ask you, how are you?
Oh, I tend to say, well.
That's a very English answer.
No, generally I'm good. I'm in the midst of a very long stretch of this year of very exciting activity, and it'd be really wrong to complain because it's been like really amazing things happening, and I'm sort of on my last stretch till the mid of November, after which I have a bit of a break.
So there is so much going on all the time, and there is this, often your work is described as it's kind of entering into your head and kind of seeing the world through your eyes, which I've always felt like it doesn't necessarily need to be this kind of being John Malkovich experience, which people think it is, you know. I feel it's more like, you know, you go to bed at night. I mean, are we allowed to say that you had a nap before we started? And then you sort of close your eyes and there's this kind of images in front of your eyes. There's so much going on. What are those images?
I very much enjoy the sort of in-between state between being awake and falling asleep, and I feel like I feel very grateful that I can do that in daytime, just for 20 minutes and sort of drift in and out, and it feels like a rewiring of the brain briefly, you know? And I mean, and at night, it's I don't think much before I sleep. I think I don't run through the day or anything.
Because I feel you have this very strong sense. You have this very strong sense of the rest of the world, kind of the world around you. And I'm wondering, is it a kind of German thing? I mean, there is a famous. There is a good German word, like a world pain. What's the word?
Well, Weltschmerz.
But yeah. Do you feel Weltschmerz?
Weltschmerz? Yeah. No, I mean, why should I feel the pain of the world all the time? No, Weltschmerz is an interesting word because it's kind of actually often used for children, no? When they have just some sense of the pain of being alive, you know, like the burden of carrying the fact that you are alive on your shoulders. You know, we're always told to love being alive, but my late partner, boyfriend, Jochen Klein, he always said, you know, being alive is a scandal.
Yeah.
You know, like that it's also, yeah, hard to bear. I mean, I'm extremely optimistic, but you know, being put into this world is also an imposition.
Yeah.
Just like death is.
Yeah. And I mean, I started with this first image of your kind of the evening before Brexit and the day after Brexit. I mean, you claimed in one of your posters, this was pre-Brexit, that what is lost forever, which is quite a kind of pessimistic claim. What has happened since, and where is the hope?
I mean, it's just this sentence came to my mind whilst I was in a club in Brooklyn called Spectrum, which was an illegal queer night monthly in some fire trap. But it, you know, New York had become so sanitized. Nightlife has become so either non-existent or sterile that this was one little pocket of freedom. And it was a very fragile pocket, and I thought, you know, if this is gone, then there's not another one right around the corner to replace it, and the same. So I had this protective sense of, or this sense of appreciation, and that then also became a line in a song. And then it ended up on one of the Brexit posters, because the Brexiteers always talked about this as a minor thing. You know, we're just exchanging this organization. We don't like the Brussels machine. This has nothing to do with the people and the peoples of Europe. When in fact, of course, this machine is not a faceless machine. It is actually the representation of those 508 million people. And once you destroy that, there's not a replacement for it. No? It took 70 years. It took an incredible bloodshed to bring the people of Europe together, to leave that past behind. And well,
So where do you see hope in this particular moment? I mean, Brexit has happened. That was your message before Brexit. I mean, what is your message now? What would be the kind of one-sentence message now?
I mean, as we know, it hasn't happened yet.
Oh, right, okay. Sorry, that is hope.
But, you know, I mean, the reason why I so very much opposed it and tried to do everything I could was that I knew that with a characteristic, with a mentality of the British press, this would get ugly the moment things turn out difficultly. And that, of course, then suddenly it won't be that machine anymore. Then there will be names called. And in good football tradition, it will be the Germans, it will be the French that are called. It won't be Slovenia or Finland. And it brought out a nationalism that was somehow, definitely not as fierce before, no? And it was sort of a peculiarity in the European family, but there is something that, well, it's not as nice, and if all these voices are pitted against each other, there is little room for compromise and little room to turn back. So I mean, even though I said it hasn't happened yet, I also can't quite see how, without losing face, this can be undone. It can probably only end in an endless transition phase, possibly.
Mm-hmm. So if I rephrase my question, is there anything, even it will sound controversial, but is there anything positive that has happened to the society? I mean, is it a kind of matter of awakening? I think it's interesting, Jean-Paul Sartre said very controversially that Paris was never freer than under the kind of Nazi occupation. You know, so is there that kind of sense, controversially, that you need to experience something to kind of exercise something drastic to exercise your freedom, or to kind of push the boundaries of.
Well, I really don't like that narrative. No? That also that art is particularly creative in hard times. I really hate it, actually. Because what would be the logic? Then should we have shit times so that the art gets better? Yeah. I think. Sorry.
I mean, it was a question of whether there's any, if you see any awakening, maybe.
Yes. No. Exactly. And that has been a little bit disappointing, I must say. You know that the British public or the liberal public is not outraged. I mean, they may be outraged privately, but you know, on the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome in March last year, 17, there was a anti-Brexit demonstration in Hyde Park, and it was the last time. I mean, they asked me to if I wanted to adapt my posters. I said, I mean, it's kind of after the event. I don't want to, as a now foreign person, even though I've been 25 years a Londoner, speak out. But anyway, I thought this could kind of be the last moment where a mass demonstration could maybe do something. And there were literally only 30,000 people, I think. And then this year, was it the second anniversary of Brexit? And you know, this was a sizable demonstration. It was 100,000 people in the West End. But some of you are too young, but a lot of you, I'm sure, have been on the streets in March 2003. You know, there were 1 to 1.5 million people on the streets of London. You know, 1 million plus to demonstrate against the Iraq war. And when you think about the gravity of what's happening right now, and that there were only 100,000 people on the street, you know,
Is it a kind of symptom that's happening across the world? I mean,
No, the Women's March in Washington the day after Trump, I mean, was huge.
What about the rest of Europe? Paris, Berlin?
I mean, there isn't a particular event to demonstrate against, like Brexit or, you know.
Well, Trump visit in Paris went fairly smoothly.
Yeah, but that's also, again, that's a different thing. You know, that wasn't the eve of causing a huge catastrophic war, or of causing of the, you know, the event of undoing 40 years of treaties and collaboration. So I think, I mean, certainly the French are, I mean, and I don't like to say the French, but you know, I mean, they obviously do demonstrate. No? I mean, they do believe in speaking out publicly.
In 2010, I think it was your show at the Serpentine Gallery, and there was an interview prior to that show where you kind of reflected on the state of London as a city at that particular moment, and you kind of suggested that that was the kind of end of a golden era of London, around maybe 2000, or maybe earlier than that. Where is London today?
I mean, I guess we all agree that London is aching, right? It's in pain, and it's a difficult time. No? Like the situation that 35 years old employees, well-paid employees at Barclays Bank cannot afford to live in their own apartment, cannot afford to start a family. I mean, that is a situation that is, you know, is known, like property prices are known to be a problem in many places in the world, but in London it is really debilitating lives, no? And it's depressing people, and I don't understand why there isn't one party, for example, suggesting to undo the short-hold tenancy lease that I, for example, all the years that I rented in London, I only ever had security for 1 year. At the 11th month, the landlord could have said bye-bye. And that's just not the case in most European countries. And so there is a certain acceptance in the UK population for things that are just kind of, I don't know, a hardship. That, I mean, I can't say that they like it, but yes, so, I mean, that's a little excursion. But so London, I mean, obviously, you know, a man who's tired of London is tired of life. We know it's an amazing
Are you
city.
tired?
No, I'm not tired of London. I'm not tired of life. I love London, and when I'm in Berlin, where I'm now spending more time than here, I feel I don't miss anything. And the moment I'm in London, I feel, you know, this is home. So obviously it's the home of 7 million people or so. And
so you're in Berlin since around 2010?
11.
And the reason is it, what's the reason?
It was really the, on the one hand, that my boyfriend Anders had moved back to Berlin 3 years earlier, and sort of long-term relation took its toll. But also the landlord of my studio in Bethnal Green would not really do anything about the state of the roof, and you know, this sense of
practical reasons.
this sense of this is not really sustainable. You know, if even I, as a successful and wealthy person, cannot really feel protected in my walls, in my four walls here, and when keeping a fragile archive is not really sustainable within Zone 2. You know, the option would have been to go to Ilford or something. And so I thought, you know what people always say, people party in Berlin and don't work in Berlin. I mean, I found myself to be working all the time in London and I found out that you can work really well in Berlin and have a good time on top, and so coming to London, I also like to enjoy the city more.
So if we just briefly go back to Brexit and that kind of moment and how it impacted your life, I'm interested to know whether it's actually impacted your work in any way. Has it?
Well, it has impacted my life because I, at the beginning of 2016, felt a sense of emergency that if no one speaks out positively for the EU, then this thing will go wrong. You know, even if the Remain people talk about it tentatively, only in favor, because they didn't talk about it in favor, they only talked about the risk. So nobody spoke positively, and I felt it's a personal emergency, so I have to do something, and I, in that moment, found words for the first time. No, I had often in previous years had ideas for posters, activist, sort of anti-xenophobic messages also, but I never found language that could really work with. I mean, and there I suddenly, it became clear in that moment, language appeared.
But is the language now staying in the realm of activism, or is it?
Yes, and so it has impacted me because suddenly I found myself being an activist, which I had no direct intention to, or no ambition to be that. And as then I then understood in March 2016, there were 3 regional state elections in Germany, and the Alternative for Deutschland right-wing party got 15% in the vote. I thought, I think I will carry this on until September 17, when it's the federal elections in Germany. And so that emergency extended, and of course the Trump emergency happened, and there are many, many more. I feel so that this has directly impacted my life in terms of time. No? Like I spend, a lot of time thinking about these things, doing things, and now I focus energy towards the European parliamentary elections in May next year, which will face an organized, well-orchestrated attack from anti-European parties and American and Russian interests who want to try to undermine the EU from inside, using the low voter turnout that is typical for the EU elections. And so I have a hope that, I want to give as much as I can for that cause, to raise voter turnout there, and in a way that would be a 3-year cycle. And I hope that there's hope at the end. No? There's because of course, the far right situation is that in Europe, in continental Europe, 80% do not vote far right. If they got together and wouldn't allow the whole political discourse to be constantly shifted to the right by the 15%, by the 22%. Even the Sweden Democrats, they didn't get 20%, or how much did they get? 18. Please, the entire Swedish political discussion, everything is about these people and their former neo-Nazi party. The 82%, they need to understand the severity of the situation we're in.
And so it looks like your activism brought you onto the social media. I was quite interested to ask you, where are the battlegrounds for this fight?
I didn't make any notes except this one, because it's sort of the battlegrounds. I think it becomes ever more clear that that what we are experiencing in the last few years is really the backlash of white males against 50 years of success of emancipation, be that women's rights or gay, lesbian, LGBTI rights, or of course more racial equality progress. So there's been an incredible success, progressive success in society in the last 50 years. And only because it's been so successful do we see this backlash. That's I mean, in particular in America, it unfortunately can be called racism. No, that is, research has shown that is a key point for the Trump revolution. The other is nationalism, which sort of goes hand in hand, meaning anti-multilateralism. But the important thing that is not discussed so much is the ideology of deregulation, which is a capitalist interest, that there are, full-on market economy capitalists hate any kind of regulation. And Rupert Murdoch, the main driving force in American behind Brexit, is, for example, one of the American billionaires that hate the EU for the regulations that it not imposes. It also didn't invent them. The EU acts because the 28 governments and heads of government ask them to act. And for example, things like the like health and safety regulations, etc., and health food standards. All those are called regulations, and we're now to believe that regulations are bad, but regulations are actually good in many cases. And reining in banks, and this ideology of deregulation is extremely powerful.
I mean, I'm quite interested in the fact that you feel at times in your interviews, in your writing, the kind of feeling of powerlessness, being powerless in front of the kind of world and the politics. It kind of comes up. And I was wondering whether you do feel powerless, especially being very influential, hence this room full of people. But, I mean, what's generating, or is there that feeling, or what's generating it?
I mean, I don't feel powerless. I also don't feel that only winning is making a cause worthwhile. I think every vote, every mind that you change matters. You cannot measure success begins at 1,000 opinions you changed, but I guess, I mean, powerless. I mean, I find, there's this particular situation in the UK and the US that the majority of, I mean, definitely in the UK, the majority of the media are owned by three tax exile billionaires, and they are exactly following that ideology of deregulation. And any body that wants to try to regulate how we live together through multilateral agreements, they fight and fight and fight, and that there's no alliance here that is calling that out even. Mm-hmm. That this whole country is dominated by these three families is, of course, making me feel powerless. Mm-hmm. But I mean, this is one example. In general, of course, we have to believe in democracy, one man, one vote, and.
Mm-hmm.
and it's a slow process.
I'm really wondering, how do we now, how do I take this conversation now towards an image? Because a photograph or an image, I mean, is there a kind of role of an image in that context? And then we can then kind of go from that context into other contexts in which you use image.
I mean, I've always had a very strong sense of my time, even as an 18-year-old, or 15-year-old, 23-year-old. And I've always had a sense of that the freedoms that I am enjoying are not to be taken for granted, and that other people have fought for them before I was born or before I was mature. And so I always had a sense of my work being very aware of its time and describing the time that I am in. And at the same time, I didn't want to be a politician or didn't want to be an activist as such, but thought the form of photography and speaking through pictures that don't have to be explained or that don't explain themselves literally all the time was the right way to speak for me, and the way that I was always in love with high art and pop art, popular culture. I found that photography was a medium that worked in both in both areas, and I developed them simultaneously. It's not that one came before the other, and I guess there was a particularly lucky time when I started that was even possible.
So when we talk about photography, are you still looking for truth in a way? Because truth is very important in a kind of political context, in a political conversation.
I never looked for truth in the work as an absolute. You know, the word is, I mean, it's impossible to talk about it across the entire spectrum, because of course when you're talking flat earth, conspiracy theory, I would like to ask that we please agree on an absolute truth. This earth is round, but then further down the spectrum, I would never have set out to say, like, I am trying to find truth. You know?
But are there aspects of your work which you think are maybe more truthful than the others?
I mean, you know, I think it's in art, it really true means when it's true to its intentions, because art is always lying about what it is depicting. Photography is always lying about what is in front of the camera, because it's always an interpretation. You know, what is on the paper is not the world, but photography never lies about is the intentions behind the camera, and that really goes for most art forms. That art describes or picks up very carefully, truthfully, the intentions behind the work. So if I approach you in a portrait sitting with a sense of arrogance, that arrogance will show. Is
that what you're trying to say now?
Well, this is not a portrait situation. Yeah. So, and if I if I made an exact graphic plan of how to take your picture and I don't want to take any risks and I just use you as a shape, then me using you as a shape will be the dominant feeling that will come from that work. And that is what I've done all my life, is a careful observation of cause and effect. So how I look into the world, that is the way the world looks in my picture, and that is always deeply political.
So are you ever afraid of misunderstanding, of your work being misunderstood?
Well, it was understood, and of course it unavoidably is misunderstood also today. You know, like you cannot be safe from that, and if you know, again, sorry, this is an endless loop. No? So if I make work trying not to be misunderstood, then the intention of not wanting to be misunderstood are written all over the work.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I'll try again. Do you have a problem about your work becoming iconic?
I mean, that's of course different from misunderstood.
Yeah.
And sorry, I don't want to become ridiculous, but of course, if the thing is, you cannot choose your work to become iconic, because the moment you want it to be iconic, its desire to be iconic is written all over it. So this state can only be this can only be given to a work, and so I'm when I was then described in the 90s, 2000s as this sort of chronicler, for example, of a generation, something that I pushed away in the 90s. Like I said, I'm not. This is not what I'm doing. Later, with hindsight, I understood to embrace it, because you cannot choose to want to be the sort of memory of a generation, or a maker of something that people connect to, because that connection you cannot manufacture, and so that certain pictures have become iconic is something I can accept, and literally, yes, I can accept it and welcome it.
Okay, so then you accept it, and then I remember at the Tate show, some very iconic images were very small, and they were kind of, in the corner. So there is an attitude towards that image, maybe.
No, I mean, the Tate show had as its premise or starting point the year 2003. There were no works from before, except in the documentation room with the printed matter and the books. So it was an idea of defining the now as something that started 2003, and that we are sort of in a continuous, ongoing mode of misunderstanding since that Ur-sin of the Iraq War. No, in every exhibition I challenge notions of importance and the difference in size of and framing and materiality of work is not like a tease, but but it is an invitation to trust your own eyes, not to think that the most important picture must be the biggest one and the central perspective one is the most important one. Like when you came into the Tate show, the first picture you saw was a 3x4 meter size print of some weed in a planter that would be bereft of light, so they were white. It was almost like a picture of nothing, so like playing with attributing value and how we attribute value is something that I like the exhibition space for. in particular. And it's something that I cannot do in a book.
And is there, I've always felt when I've seen your work, even in a book format, it's a very kind of, for me at least, from a kind of maybe architectural perspective, it's a very kind of urban experience. I feel like, you know, going through a city, you know, some light passing in front of me, entering a park, seeing some rotten, you know, vegetables on the ground, looking up at the sky. You know, it's a kind of this kind of fusion of emotions. And I was wondering whether there is a narrative to the show, because each show, it feels like a story of some sort.
I mean, there's certainly not a linear narrative in my work, no? And in an exhibition, there are connections between works, and they can be on different tiers, like formal, like lines or color or narrative, or you know, different types of or similar types of people, or a sense of smell or touch that I hope a picture evokes, I mean, for example, I mean, we are resting here, and Marko brought these two installation views that I.
Yeah, because maybe we can. I mean, we can slowly move into architecture. I guess the question before we talk about that image is the question that you've often been almost told that you're an architect in a way, and it's precisely because of the way you attribute value to images, almost like the way an architect would attribute value to windows, views. I think Mark Wheatley told you that you're an architect in a conversation 10 years ago. Do you feel you are an architect?
Well, I always felt a closeness to architecture, to the meaning of spaces, and that everything that is in a space means something, and everything that is in a space, or actually on a building, or that makes a building, is there for a reason, because all of it is man-made. No? They are all decisions that people have made, and here I have to come back again to this cause and effect observation, no? That a building expresses exactly what ideas went into it, no? And because I am a sort of I guess sensitive being, I respond to the things around me, and I pick up what goes on in a space, or what buildings tell me, and so I've had a very aware eye for architecture, but never felt that I should do it myself outside of my exhibitions. But I think as early as, I mean, the late 90s, did I start to have opportunities to build exhibition architecture, and so, for example, in 2006, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, there were like two vast empty spaces where the entire architecture I made, or the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, 2012. So exhibition architecture is something that I'm very familiar with, and then I have in recent years also made more direct architectural interventions, for example, in the.
Because I mean, there's one thing which is an empty space, but then there's another thing where you're kind of given a space and you respond to it, presumably, with the way you set your narrative.
Yes.
I mean, how much of the exhibition comes from the space when you're given a space, and how much of it is your imposed plan?
I mean, it's very much looking at a space without prejudice. You know, it's just accepting that I cannot always get the ideal place, and so not to look down on a place. So that and not you know, not see security exits as like my enemy. You know,
because I was going to ask whether you see architecture in a kind of confrontational way.
It's
Where do
only,
you feel you confront it sometimes?
It's only the minds behind architecture
okay, so
that are confrontational sometimes.
Right. Okay. Oh,
the minds that are behind museum architecture.
You mean the architects?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, there's one extreme example. For example, in the Kunstmuseum Wolfsburg in Germany, the architect, who I don't know who was the architect, but at the end of each stud wall, is that a stud wall? He put like a metal bracket, like half a meter of metal covering around it, like a U shape. So every wall has this brace, and you look at half a meter of a brushed metal surface. I mean, I mean, that is just very much the architect wanting to be present. I don't mean the architect should be not present at all. No, like there are amazing buildings where the architect is present and it's a joy. No? But yeah.
Okay, 2 buildings this summer. There was exhibitions, and I thought we maybe refer to those 2. This is Nîmes in France, a building by Norman Foster. I mean, we can see that the doors are beautifully concealed. The skirting doesn't quite go across, but it's okay. And then and then it stops there, and then it doesn't go. And then there is of course these fire escape buttons and swipe cards, and then I think what's amazing, there is, okay, I can't really see those photographs, but then there is Oscar Niemeyer, kind of overlooking this kind of regulations. And there are no regulations in Brazil. So yeah, anyway, can you tell us about that confrontation? I mean, was there a confrontation?
No, it's a curious building. The museum is called Carré d'Art, and it's opposite a Roman temple called Maison Carrée, and the Carré d'Art is from the outside a total postmodern early 90s building of white covered plastic, steel and metal in this white, what is it actually? Is it PVC or coating or what? A lot of British buildings from that era are like that. This
plaster maybe?
No, it's plastic. I mean, it's metal and which is covered in a thin layer. It's not painted.
Powder coating. Powder coating. No,
powder
it's not
coating.
powder
Yes,
coating.
possibly.
No, it's not powder coating.
And anyway, the whole entire building is
maybe
white.
It's polyester.
And
coating. It's a coating.
And then on the and it's a huge stairwell and atrium, and the steps are made of glass, so brushed matte glass, and it's really vertiginous and sort of follows this ideology of space and open and transparency, and it brings together a library and sort of the entire city's cultural activity under one roof. And then in the top 2 floors is the modern art museum of the city of Nîmes. And in these galleries where I exhibited the temporary exhibition spaces, when you get in there, then you're suddenly in this classical gallery feel with a marble floor. you know, this whole building is about transparency and white and glass, and then here you have this stone floor, but because it's not real, you know, all the tiles are lying on a metal grid, which are uneven, and there are lots and lots of them are cracked and broken, and it is, on the one hand, it has this grand feel of a cool stone gallery, and actually that is the dominant feel. Plus, being inaugurated in '93 makes you think probably it was thought of conceptualized in '88 or something like that. So that was the time of Julian Schnabel and gigantic paintings. Art in those days looked very different from even 10 years after. And so the walls, the lowest ceiling, I think, is 5.50 meters, and some were like even 8 meters, I believe, tall, and which is sort of a completely unuseful height for a lot of art. And it's, for example, again, this slightly macho, supporting, wanting huge paintings, gesture that this was built for, and for me, I didn't. I was fortunate. I'm fortunate that my type of installation allows me to respond and have benefit from height, and so I went against it and I went with it. So a lot of rooms are hung in a very linear fashion, which I'm not so associated with, but which I have done from the beginning of my career. I've always hung either from floor to ceiling in different arrangements, but also always, to counter that, hung in linear ways.
And then at the same time, the exhibition in Johannesburg is happening. A slightly different space.
Yes. This is the third stop in an exhibition tour of the African continent. It was in January in Kinshasa, in Nairobi in April, and here in Johannesburg Art Gallery in South Africa, which is a 120 years old colonial building.
By another British architect, actually, interestingly.
It must be, no?
Yeah.
Yes.
Latvians, Edwin, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Which at his time, he was this, but he was the Norman Foster, kind of a Norman Foster of the early 20th century,
wow.
Which is very interesting. That we have a kind of both British, but in a different kind of way.
Yes. And
approaching the outside world. So the early 20th century one, colonial power imposes its architecture in Johannesburg, and then here we have a much more sort of capitalist-driven power again.
well, in aid of a municipal, very more egalitarian European project in Nîmes, no? I mean, it was like a citizens. I mean, it wasn't uncontroversial, no? Some citizens ask, why should we have such a massive museum? But anyway, in Johannesburg, that gallery has a particularity that I first had to deal with in 2000 when I was in the exhibition Apocalypse at the Royal Academy in Piccadilly. Which is something you're not really aware of until you notice it, which is called the dado rail. You've got one there, and you've got it here across all the walls. And what?
You know why it's there? You know why the dado rail is there?
No.
Do you want to tell us?
Could you? That you don't bash up the walls with a chair. Yes, I mean, I suspected that has...
It's a logical answer.
That has a reason, but why is it always in galleries? You know, in galleries you don't have that many chairs.
Maybe sometimes to break up the space, the size, the feeling of space.
Yes, and that's what I noticed in the Royal Academy. I didn't find it so interesting to work with, whereas here in Johannesburg, it really does something for the wall. It frames it in a very different way. I mean, it really was...
Because you didn't seem to confront it very much. You kind of accepted the...
Well, you can't really confront it unless you take a circular saw and... It allows what?
For movement, because things move and it opens up certain
Yeah, okay. I mean, I then also at times I also hung pictures underneath the dado rail, which I mean, in a way, it'd be interesting to flick through more of.
So I think it's quite nice that you had a little lecture on architecture. Do you want to give us a lecture, your thoughts on some architecture? So do you want to show us some of your observations?
Yes. Yes, I did, because I genuinely do care about architecture, and it has not gone unnoticed on architects, like, for example, or architectural critics. I had Mark Wrigley, I had a dialogue with him in 2006, and he wrote an essay, and we had a discussion. I also sat in on a couple of crits, end-year crits at the Städelschule architecture class, and I always felt a desire to be in dialogue with architects, and around that time, in the mid-2000s, I for the first time wrote down the words "book for architects," where I had this feeling I want to share, almost be like a mirror, not a teacher, not a critic, but just sort of share how I see architecture, how I see it work, and that comes from different aspects, or from different perspectives of awe, or of smell, or of admiration, or beauty, or study, and sometimes criticism. Usually not mockery, and so I brought 30 slides that were first shown as part of this Book for Architects project, which never became a book, but it was a digital slideshow that lasts 40 minutes, which was first shown at the Rem Koolhaas Venice Architecture Biennale, Elements of Architecture, in 2014, and which since has become kind of one of the first works in the Metropolitan Museum's newly founded architecture department collection, and so, just a few thoughts. This is something this is the Maritime Hotel, the view out of the Maritime Hotel in New York, and I really like these round windows, which strangely feel quite natural. You know, they're of course extremely loud when you first see the building, and it's very unusual. But there's something I find very literally natural to live with, and it was built as a retirement home for seamen, for maritime workers, so they could feel at home at sea. I have a soft spot for solid wood handrails. And
we don't judge. We won't judge you for that.
and in like a year ago, on a research trip to Coventry, where we were visiting the Coventry Cathedral because I'm doing the stage design of the English National Opera production of War Requiem by Benjamin Britten, which opens mid-November. And in Coventry Station, there's also this super solid, chunky handrail. And I always get a sense of generosity from that. There's a value in it that doesn't get less over age. No? It gets kind of better. This is in Santiago de Chile. And always traveling, having traveled a lot, but then since 2008, roughly 9, I went on trips, particularly to put myself outside of my comfort zone or outside of areas that I knew culturally or understood well. And when you do that, you realize that, 90% of the world's architecture is probably made without architects. So this is in Tunisia, where buildings, according, I guess, to Islamic beliefs, are also, people don't take credit. They build the money that they have, and then when they have more money, they continue the floor above. No? This is in Lima, Peru. It's hard to understand what exactly goes on. That's near Delhi in India. And that's in Haiti, where, a popular way of building is you just take a plastic barrel and pour concrete in it and let it settle and then cut off the barrel. And
then assemble it again. And
yes.
Pour more concrete.
One thing that which illustrates or gives you an idea how I read architecture and how I am always aware of, like, everything looks the way it looks for a reason. And so this look in St. Petersburg at the ballet in the intermission looks this way for a reason. And the reason being that the architects who built the toilets for men and women gave them exactly the same footprint in the floor plan.
Of course, it's nothing to do with St. Petersburg, it's everywhere. This is the scene.
Here on the left, it's the Vatican Museum. On the right, it's the Versailles Castle. Everywhere where there's crowds, you see women stand in line, whilst men, like we can see, you see here, the guy, walk in and don't have to wait. And I just don't understand why, here in a room of architects, I like to ask, why on earth is that not changing?
Apparently, I have heard that the new Royal Opera House refurbishment has addressed that. That's what I've heard. I haven't. But yeah,
it's just different speeds of going about business.
I mean,
So there's not many accusatory pictures.
Have you ever exhibited in a toilet?
In a toilet, yes. The famous Georgian Dragon pub in Shoreditch, and it's called the gallery that Pablo Leon de la Barra ran there for years and years. Was called the White Cubicle, and
so it was a unisex toilet.
For that night, it was a temporary. So for the opening, it became unisex, and then it stayed
It'd
there.
be quite nice to curate differently for curate your work differently for men and women. It would be quite nice.
Oh, yeah, this was unisex. And that is Gatwick Airport some years ago. When you look at the sign, it says "Rest of World Passports." This this Eurocentric perspective. Let's see what it says then.
And then there's sort of 2 kilometers of queuing
Yes.
after that sign. You know, it's another. I mean, that's another. It's similar to the toilet thing. The queuing.
The inequality of queuing?
Well, yeah, the airports. Like
True.
you get the rest of the world queuing for hours, and
Yes. True. Yes,
I mean, I queue always.
because you're from Serbia.
So I actually do. Yeah. So I do know the feeling, even though I'm not a woman.
And I mean, exhibition architecture is often done in this really ramshackle way, like here in the National Art Gallery in Warsaw. And this this picture I called device control from 2005, and it's in Moscow. And I just thought it's a very practical approach to architecture. No? Instead of fixing I mean, you know that something is going to happen, so you put put a catchment device for what you know is going to happen.
Has a purpose.
So I've I also in 2001 I called an exhibition "View from Above" because it was the title of a loose series of cityscapes that I made from elevated points of view, commercial planes or towers or buildings, and I just got off on this. This like cities as organisms that are beyond a master plan, no? That they are this result of millions and millions of decisions, and that very soon also are out of the hand of the architect. No? And then somebody else makes an addition here and there, and or I have an acute awareness or eye for how things join, that interests me, or how they not join, and how surfaces collide. This is a joint I love. It's the London Tube, I believe. Is it Angel or?
Yellow tiles. I don't know.
But it's kind of so open about, no? Like here we are joining these two things. No? It's not hiding it. It's kind of and I mean this, for example. I mean I am a bit of a modernist guy, and like English modernism. I also like this way that the floor curves up. And because corners are, I'm sure as you architects know, I mean corners are always a problem, and how they are resolved.
If we take it back to politics, it's a sign of wealth, really, being able to produce these pieces that, if you go to any kind of poorer country, you'll never see anything like that.
Mm. True. Yes,
Anyway.
like joints, like.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd see
Here.
something like that.
This is in Colombia. And as part of these travels, I also went to places that were sort of famous and kind of too famous to be that one should be interested in it. Or I thought, like why go to the Iguazu waterfalls? or you don't really need to see the Sydney Opera House, but then when you see it, you know why it's famous, no? Because sometimes famous things are good because they're good, no? And but what I never had an idea of was the texture of that the Sydney Opera House here, which you see close up. You know, you only ever know the shape, but this incredible detailing was amazing, and that type of exposed concrete building has almost entirely disappeared, with the exception of the Charles de Gaulle new terminal, no? Where you have exposed concrete again. Here, Sao Paulo.
There's some good exposed concrete. A Canada water station. And
an entire city without advertising. You know, the mayor municipality of Sao Paulo decided 10 years ago that there should be no advertising anymore because it had gotten so out of control. And then this picture, which is sort of symptomatic for a world of architecture we live in. I call this a cladding, and it's from 2009. It's, it could be any continent, any airport, and yeah, there's like the pervasiveness of and similarity of this style is really shocking or impressive. No? Like this is Addis Abeba, and this is Jeddah in, oh, there's a round window, in Saudi. And this one is called Shit Buildings Going Up Left, Right and Center.
oh, this is London.
Yeah, this is my former studio in the White Building. The first floor was my studio from 2001 to 2011 for 10 happy years. Well, when I got out, it was also about time, no? Like, as you can see, no? It was like now the whole thing, everything is surrounded by this type of cladding buildings, no? Like it's just an IKEA shelf, really, with things hung in front. And this is something that, I don't know, it can, of course, amuse you, but it can also pain you. It's, you know, what is this? Is this 50s or 60s building, built along, like in London, East London, in a modern tradition, and then in some renovation they put this palace portal there, and this is in Dublin. So when we give people the choice, they then put their country house window or some other illusion of palatialness, like here on Buenos Aires on the right, and Sao Paulo bottom left, and St. Petersburg top left. And one has to wonder, really, what is this desire for palaces and obvious rejection of modernism in architecture by many people, and Sigmar Gabriel, the Social Democrat foreign minister, last year said what we're experiencing right now is anti-moderne, that the entire populism, right wing, is kind of an anti-moderne, an anti-modern movement, and we feel this is, of course, slightly ugly, but it has more meaning than just being a sort of variation in taste. and I love sort of built-in architectural details, which I feel are also increasingly lost. For example, this bathroom built in the 1960s in Germany has this little alcove for the toothbrush, etc. And nowadays, at least in Germany, every bathroom that is being built has the water, what is it, canister for the toilet, set in front of the wall rather than build it into the wall. And so then you clad that canister with a shelf, but across the entire bathroom wall. And that then is then used for toothbrush, etc. But it somehow is so clear where it comes from. No? It's just this hollow box that takes up space, really, and rather than this care for detail to set it in. I mean, so that's the sort of thing I look at when you're since you asked me what sort of images go around in my head.
Or before you fall asleep.
Yes. Or this one here is a view of my apartment, my flat in London until 2001. It was this Bourne estate in Chancery Lane, which was built in like 1895, a social housing complex, and it has again like these beautiful details, these inbuilt details, alcoves for, you know, it was social housing, no? It was built for that, and there's a generosity, a care for detail that I mean, I'm missing in a lot of architecture today, you know, which is of course all driven by money. But since I am here talking to future or real life architects, I just, you know, would like to encourage this generosity that detail creates, and that I believe these corners are well-made, emboxed details that are not just cleaned away. They are spaces where thoughts can catch in. Or this is, I guess, this is Polish modernism in Warsaw. You know, there's a sense of generosity, giving each person also the opportunity to look out in the other direction. And this is the dire reality of late 90s London architecture, or an update, sort of try to update a building with just a little wavy piece of metal that starts to peel. The paint peels off after 5 years. And a reminder to all, just water. I mean, I turned 50 this year, no? And I would not have thought of water in buildings when I was 23, no? But having experienced water coming into places. I lived in about 5 times in a Berlin apartment in 15 years. And of course in London, in the studio all the time. And it's just fascinating. No? This is a ceiling in a hotel in New York, no? Like a concrete building, top floor. And the latex paint sort of became this bubble. Always take good care of water in buildings.
That's mostly what we do. Okay, I'm sure people would like to ask some questions.
Thank you.
So should we let the people ask? I think there'll be a microphone so we can be heard on the recording. There's a question there.
Hi. I wanted to ask about the way that you juxtapose imagery with words. I mean, you spoke about it a little bit, but especially on social media, like on your Instagram account or that kind of thing, or whether it started with the posters, I wanted to know how you chose the imagery, because to me there's something well, very obvious about the words. They are very straightforward, whereas the imagery, because it's juxtaposed with the text, you're almost looking for the same message in the image as you are in the text, or looking for some kind of literal meaning in the imagery that often I don't think is actually there, perhaps.
Yes. No, I mean that in the 70s there used to be a socialist magazine in Germany called Konkret, and they put naked women on the cover for a period. I think when Ulrike Meinhof of the Bader Meinhof was the editor, they did that, and so you get attention for something else you want to tell and talk about. There's not one linear strategy that I use for what I post how on Instagram, but in principle, I would say they are not works of mine. It's kind of it allows myself to be an amateur photographer, and I mean I like them, of course. I don't try to make bad pictures, but it's a playful outlet on the one hand. But I never started Instagram for that. Like I started only with pictures of words, and then I guess got more playful with it and combined the pictures with text, but also not always kind of not to be for people to expecting also political commentary all the time. No? So it's really quite sparse, no? But it does stand out because of it, no? When it does happen, I had really no social media strategy, maybe except for that I didn't do it. You know, like I only have a face, like a name holder, Facebook. I've never done Facebook, but there is something that I enjoy about Instagram, and that seems to really communicate.
Well, and with that, like the text is almost is usually very political, but the images are rarely. Like, do you have the same kind of or a similar kind of direct political photography, or is it just in the text?
I mean, there is this picture which I chose not to show, but now I choose to show, because I'm sure that you are all too aware of this particular most literal example of that everything in architecture looks the way it looks for a reason, and the intentions you can read truthfully. Like, for example, you know, if this was combined with, I mean, I could use this for a post about homelessness, but I was not campaigning. I don't do my work as a campaigner, and it's just keeping things also, like not be too preachy. By the way, this is one, the other slide I didn't show it, don't know why. This is what Dubai, the other side of Dubai looks like. This is the quarters where all the workers live. And this on the right is one of the nondescript thousands and thousands of buildings where guys live in rooms of 8 shared beds, and it is literally one of these buildings in the center of the photograph on the left.
Another
Yep.
question at the
Oh, hi, thank you. I would just like to ask you about how you feel about the art market, because it probably encapsulates the epitome of, capitalism and under-regulation, and, facilitates evasion, laundering, and speculation. So do you feel like it comes into conflict with your own political beliefs?
It just yesterday opened in London, that frieze. It's not there's not a short answer. For example, the money laundering aspect, I have a very clear idea about that. I noticed when I started to sell works in the early, like 93, 95, part of the 90s, that I was asked by my gallerists, this guy wanted to pay in cash, and say, okay, if I give you cash, and in '96 I basically told all gallerists I don't take cash because it's black money, it's money from tax evasion, and I like to pay taxes. I'm happy to pay taxes because that is what keeps society together as a functioning state. No, we can't have a social security, etc., and paved streets for nothing. And so I make sure that all my work is on the books and properly taxed, and the art market, you can't, of course. When I know, and it's hard to know where money comes from. To make a long story short, I've been very fortunate that my work for the longest time has not been sort of one trademark style that is just one type of picture that is super iconic in a large edition, a repeated style, that my work has become like a trophy. And I feel like it has, most people that have bought my work did buy it because they actually like it and because they have seen it. No, they haven't just sort of asked an art advisor.
Do you get to control where your work is? So is there any of your work at the frieze at the moment?
Yes. So,
and is that your...
Yes.
You can
so there's
control that.
3 galleries that show my work, and I discuss exactly with them what is shown, and I make sure that they all show different works. But what people don't know or are not so aware of is that once the artwork is sold, it is a complete free thing. It's in the hands of the collector. Again, here the European Union introduced the droit de suite regulation so that the artist could at least get 3%, I think, of an auction result from a resale of a work, but your question, yeah, I mean, it is art is something that you only start to own or to buy, except you make it yourself or your children make it or you're being given it once you have gone across a certain level of wealth, and so it is connected to that, and at the same time looking back at history, of course, art that I admire, like a Caravaggio, say, was also made from money for moneyed people or a moneyed church, and I don't think one does do art justice by completely sort of weighing it into good and bad. No? So if it's for money, it's evil, or what amount of money does it become evil? It's money, and that's maybe the last part of the answer. A good aspect about an artwork being expensive is that it protects the work, because it won't get thrown away by the children of the collector, and it might not even get thrown away by the great children of the collector. And it's, honestly, I'm not joking. And that is, it's taken care of well, the more expensive it is, and yeah. Does this satisfy?
Stefan.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about your, I don't know if it's the right word, or your approach or lack of approach or non-approach towards found footage and found images, particularly in the context of things that are found online, like news media, CCTV cameras, cell phone footage that gets disseminated and downsized, and how, if you use that sort of alongside the photographs that you take. And the reason why I'm asking is I feel that, if you take, like, for example, the Supreme Court hearings, or, the Syrian boy that was found in Turkey on the beach, that we somehow inhabit kind of those images as well on a daily basis. They make up a large part of how we relate to the rest of the world. And I was wondering if you sort of engage with that sort of media as well in yours.
I sort of since childhood days have engaged with news photography, and always had a very tactile relation almost to newsprint, and I have sort of, before I used a camera, before I owned a camera, I started to make photomechanical pictures with a very early digital photocopier in the mid-1980s, photocopying also found images. So that was, and then in 1990, I made an exhibition project and a book called Soldiers, the 90s, which comprised of almost 90% pictures from newspapers and magazines of soldiers, and which was looking at the use of that particular group of people in the media. And as I sort of realized that these are the only non-famous people that get put on the cover of a newspaper on a regular basis, shown doing nothing. In the time of the Yugoslav wars, you didn't see the atrocities. You only saw soldiers as peacekeepers, sort of smoking a cigarette. Anyway, I'm not. And then in 2005, I started the project Truth Study Center, which are these collages, tables that confront sort of news pictures and stories with my own. To this date, I find news photography incredibly resonant, and it was also, of course, what the pop artists felt, who, when I started looking at art when I was 14, 15, 16, the Warhols and Rauschenbergs in the museums in the Rhineland, they were printed news photographs on canvas, and that has very much informed my thinking about painting and photography.
Thank you.
An interesting expectation I had recently is, like, all of a sudden your art is proliferating in a very soft way as well. I more than once was sitting in a pub thinking, oh, that's a nice image, and only then stepped up and saw it was just a very cheap photocopy a student put there for either the anti-AFD campaign or for anti-Brexit campaigns and things like that. So this kind of proliferation of actually as well the image, because that's the first thing standing out. How do you work with that as well? Or is it a discovery? I mean, because literally all over universities you find all of a sudden your posters and in all kinds of formats, and small and big, and yeah. And they always draw first by the image rather than the text. Or
it really was a lucky coincidence that I'm grateful for, that that the exhibition on the verge of visibility at the Serralves Museum in Porto, in Portugal, ended in the spring 2016, literally as I was formulating these different Brexit messages, and had that show run 2 months longer, I would have never have chosen these pictures of horizons and fades and clouds and skies for this, because I would not have dared to sort of weigh down this work that was sort of for the first time shown in this museum together in this grouping. I would not have even wanted to have done that to the museum director, like suddenly sort of hijack that work out of an exhibition, no, where it stands for itself. And those works, and at the opening of the show in January, I did speak about those lines being borders, no, and horizons being borders, what the sea being borders. So they had a political undertone for me, but I was very aware not to wanting to weigh them down and nail them down. But then this show had come to an end, and I realized suddenly the potential that they, and how well they work with the text, that I then sort of sacrificed them for that purpose, and they have, fortunately, they have survived, because I mean I can still look at them without the text, but it's a, you know, it's a sacrifice in a way, you know? It's because, you know, it's not that poster. I don't see that as art. No? It functions as a communication tool in a different way.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Yeah.
If anyone has it.
Yes.
Allow me to ask a quite broad question, but now you have spoken a bit about the role of generosity in architecture, and I'm really curious to hear about the role of generosity in your photo and in your art. That's something that I sense in your work somehow. So, yeah.
The role of what?
Of generosity.
Generosity. I mean, it's something that I find is one of the things that I find hard to say yes to, because the moment you say yes, it feels calculated and not generous anymore. You know, like I can't say I'm sensitive, no? Like, because, you know, if somebody who says wholeheartedly I'm sensitive, that feels. I mean, for me, there's always has to be a great deal of doubt in that, and so generosity is something that I don't want to achieve. It maybe comes from something that it happens because of things that I don't do, and you know, that, for example, I've often found that it's easy to make a work look complicated, difficult to make, but it's much harder to make something look simple and easy, and or to create a low threshold for the viewer, so I try to not erase my own hand, but I don't want to point at me in my works. I want you to recognize yourself in, even if it is only 5% or 2% or 10% of my work, if I feel I can make it so low threshold and so little barrier that points at me, that you get the opportunity to feel, I know how that smells, or I once remembered that touch. And that is a sense of connection. And when that happens, when that happens for me, when I look at art, or I hear a song, or I read something, and I get this resonance, that is a moment where I feel less lonely. That's a moment of solidarity between people, and that's that's when I feel my work works best. And that was probably...
Yeah, I think we could speak for another 5 hours, but thank you so much for coming to the AA, and we hope we can continue this conversation. There's so many more questions. There's so many more questions. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Marko. Thank you, Marko.
Thank you, Wolfgang.
Oh yeah, and there are books up front. I don't get any money for sales from that book. But
he already took the money.
They have a favor to ask you. Basically, their cloud machine is broken, so they wanted to know if you could sign some of the books so that they can still sell them tomorrow.
Oh yes.
Should I bring them over here?
I can go there.
So you're going to get mold twice, not with each. Yes. And then as soon as people start talking to you, I'll get some caps.